Good morning, afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on accelerating IT and security compliance with 4CRisk Compliance Map product used for NIST and more. My name is Yo McDonald, and I'm part of the team at 4CRisk, and we're delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar. First, let me give you two important points. One, the webinar is recorded and you'll get a link next week. Okay. Secondly, we really encourage you to ask questions throughout the entire session. So use that chat box down below. I'll be actually monitoring that, and I'll get the questions to the panelists by the time the Q&A section comes. Okay, are we good? Let's move right now on to the learning objectives. So what do we intend or hope for you to have learned from this session, from this discussion, from this demonstration? First of all, we would hope that you're able to more deeply understand the use case. We're looking for you to expand your understanding of the challenges for IT and security people in ways that are a little bit more than you've been conventionally used to. These are the top priorities that you have in keeping your organization safe. What are the best practices? There's a lot of good discussion on that. Then we're going to deep dive into the use case on NIST. You're going to see how the time taken to assess the mappings from a framework to your internal control framework, it's policy, controls, risk, whatever, can go from months to minutes. So we'll look at the Guidewire case for that. Then we're going to move into imagination mode and we'll look at the more side. What other wonderful use cases are possible now that you've seen the technology? And then by the end, we hope that you will have started to really appreciate the benefits of this breakthrough AI technology and be able to think about ways that you can deploy it in your organization to really lessen the work, the burdensome manual effort that your teams are putting out right now to do these kinds of mappings. Okay, so that's our wish. I'll go now to introduce our wonderful panel members, and starting with Grace Beeson from Guidewire Software. Grace is a distinguished expert in GRC. You may have seen her on lots of conferences or webinars and actually speaking in person. She has 2 decades of GRC experience, really rolling out complex programs globally in companies like DXC, HP, in addition to Guidewire. And she's also co-founded Mercury Risk and Compliance with Gavin. You'll hear a little bit about that later. But a secret little interesting point about Grace is that she actually started her career as a clinical social worker. And there she started to have an appreciation of human motivation, what drives us. And she was able to pivot that into being able to discuss complex problems with leadership. She fell in love with legal and compliance. She started to work with very deep, complex frameworks in risk and compliance and legal and regulatory. And she found her passion. She actually started a methodology called automated control efficacy testing methodology, which he's rolled into some of the Mercury work. But what's important about Grace is that she's got a ton of experience in both IT and OT environments in risk management, and she's just passionate about this subject. So we're really happy to have her on the panel. Now, Gavin is also an incredible person. He's a pioneering figure in cybersecurity. Again, many of you may have seen him speak at ISACA, IIA, other conferences as well. He's known for his technical prowess, his depth of understanding of all the intricate parts in a very large infrastructure. If you see what he's done with his career the last couple of decades, he's worked in cybersecurity functions, leadership, CISO roles at Meta, Verizon, HP, and so on. Also in the financial industry, and he's really celebrated for the contributions that he's made to the industry and best practices. And if you've ever heard of the grounds rule, that's Gavin. Gartner talks about it. So his passion is really around risk quantification in a new way, and it's just going to blow your mind and make you think very deeply and profoundly as we get into this discussion. Our next panelist is Supra Apikonda. He is the co-founder and COO at 4CRisk. And he's got decades of experience rolling out very complex GRC programs to Fortune 1000 companies. So his supra power is understanding what client requirements are and really translating them into solutions, innovative solutions that are actually going to drive value and work in complex environments. So we're very happy to have him here. He's not only going to be part of the lively debate, but he's going to be navigating us through the demonstration. So he will be able to tie all the points together that other people are making and really say, look, you see how the technology is actually doing that. And finally, we have our very own Susan Palm, our Chief Revenue Officer at 4CRisk. And Susan is the epitome of a customer advocacy person. She's going to be our moderator in this panel. She's well suited to the role. She's used to driving home really thoughtful questions, penetrating questions. So she's going to be keeping the panel members on their toes. She's got tons of experience in very senior positions, chief risk officers, cybersecurity, audit, third-party management in the financial services industry and in technology companies alike. So she's going to be quite the person on the moderation front. And another little secret about Susan is that she's defended compliance programs to the FDIC and to regulators. So she really knows what is required when the rubber meets the road and you have to put the evidence on the table. So she serves as an advisor to several technology companies. She's always a good person to go to if you want to hear about best practices. She's got a lot of experience and wisdom. So great panel, buckle up, good discussion. I'll see you at the end when we get all our questions together. Right now, I'm going to pass over to Gavin, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his new breakthrough company.
Joe, everybody, great to be here. Appreciate you carving out some time from your day to spend it with us. Looking forward to having a good interactive conversation, good interactive session. And hopefully every one of us will walk away from today's time together with perhaps either a refresh perspective or a new perspective or just something that we hadn't thought about when we were having our tea or coffee earlier today. So yeah, just a little bit about Mercury. We formed Mercury Risk and Compliance about 1.5 years ago, but it's been a long time in the making. As Joe mentioned earlier, Grace Beeson she's a co-founder of Mercury. And one of the historical things that we have in common is actually the work that we did extensively in the outsourcing industry, specifically IT and OT outsourcing, with also some business process outsourcing. And what we learned from that over those years was, as an example, when it comes to risk and compliance and cybersecurity, we were not responsible for one corporation or one organization. We had the best part of 4,000 different organizations that we were delivering IT, OT, and business process and outsourcing services to. So that means 4,000 or so organizations, everything from military to government to gas and oil to energy to banking to airlines, manufacturing, across 60 different countries. So when you put that into the context, first of all, of cyber risk, when you put that into the context of regulatory compliance and therefore regulatory risk, I'm not sure if there's not a regulation somewhere on the planet that we had not had to manage and deal with. And we had to do that at scale. And so just wind the clock forward, about 2 years ago, You know, as Joe mentioned earlier, you know, I'd gone through my journey, if you like, through HP and HPE and DXC and Verizon and Meta, and Grace had gone through a similar path, but not all the same companies. So a couple of years ago, I just reached out to Grace and said, "Hey, you know what? You know what I think our industry really needs is that kind of expertise all brought together." And so we've spent the last couple of years essentially building Mercury. And some of the things that make it, we think, you know, well, we don't just think it, what's been kind of proven out already, is you know the old adage of you know the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So we were thinking, well, why is it that we see this across our industry of peers across the globe, that it seems no matter how hard we try, no matter how diligent we are, sometimes things are just still not working. And so what we looked at when we think about risk management, when most people think about risk and risk quantification in the context of cyber, for example, they think about loss avoidance. You know, so trying to estimate or guesstimate or put some pseudo mathematics around how do we calculate what losses we might have incurred, you know, primary losses, secondary losses, and try and put some likelihood factor, and then demonstrate, well, that's how we're going to manage risk in the cyber and technology risk domains. And the interesting thing, or the irony almost, is that in any other risk domain, any other business risk domain, the objective is not to reduce risk. The objective is to optimize risk. It's to get a return on risk. And so foundationally and fundamentally, what we've done is we've come up with an operating model, and it's truly operating, that focuses not exclusively on loss avoidance, but actually focuses on risk management through the eyes of value protection. And that could be present value or future value. So that shift, as almost academic as it might sound, has made a huge impact in how to make near real-time operational decisions and strategic decisions in the context of cyber and technology risk, and therefore by extension into other domains such as user risk, technology risk, and regulatory risk as well. So we're excited about what we're doing. Our customers to date are excited about what we're doing, and excited to see how we can share some of those insights with you all today.
Great.
And Grace, maybe I think I should hand over to you, and you can kind of give a little bit of background on yourself.
Sure. You know, as Yo said, and as Gavin said, I started my career as a clinical social worker, and then fell into compliance, mostly starting with healthcare and HIPAA. And then in Hewlett Packard moved into regulatory compliance on a very large global scale with working with Gavin. From there, I went to Guidewire, where we are an insurance software company, and we specialize in casualty and liability insurance software. And so I'm the director of GRC. In addition to my role with Mercury, I'm the director of GRC at Guidewire Software. And you know, one of the things I discovered when I joined Guidewire is that while it was a smaller number of regulations, we're also still in a lot of different regions and continually growing. We're in a massive growth spurt. And in the 4 years that I've been with Guidewire, we've emerged into at least 2 or 3 different regions. And with that came the need to then also evaluate our posture from our security and compliance perspective against additional regulatory environments. And we're not necessarily going into different industry verticals. We're going into different regions and with different customers, sometimes with different customer types. And so they may have different regulatory requirements. You know, while a lot of it's fintech, you know, there are the companies that will join us. And so occasionally we'll also have a different and industry that we need to look at, but a lot of it for us is regional regulatory compliance, a lot with privacy. As we know, there's emerging privacy regulations throughout the United States, and then in Europe and APAC. So we are constantly looking at how do we stay abreast of all of those things? How do we make sure that the controls that we have in place now are going to meet the needs of all of our regulatory requirements? And that's a daunting task. So trying to do that, you know, manually is inefficient. I'm going to talk a little bit more of that as the session goes on.
Right. Thanks, Grace. Well, a little bit about what we're doing at 4CRisk, and I appreciate the fact that Gavin kind of teed us up and said, you know, we're in kind of a transformational mode, right? We have to rethink how we're doing business, and we have technologies such as Mercury Risk and Compliance, and also what we're doing here at 4CRisk, where we're leveraging AI to help companies establish their rule books so that, to Grace's point, they can keep their eyes on all of the rules that they have to manage to ensure evidence of compliance, that they can also keep up with the regulatory changes that are affecting all of the countries and the products that they're delivering to the market. And the other point that is equally important, which is assessing the impact of your internal governance against all of this regulatory change and all of your requirements, standards, and policies. And we'll show you a little bit about how we can use technology to really accelerate the answer to the question, okay, a regulation has changed, how does this affect me? That is particularly challenging. And then when you have gaps in your policies and controls, you can use generative AI, of course, to suggest a starting point, a risk statement, a policy and control language. And then we layer a conversational AI, our friend Aria up here in the corner, who's looking at all of that documentation that you have in your organization and helping your front line get answers to complex questions. So that is what we're doing in terms of trying to address some of the complexity that Gavin and Grace have both articulated. And then, of course, taking all this data and rolling it into our GRC. Gavin, you mentioned this point about transformation and finding new ways to do business. Companies have always focused on controls to ensure they're in compliance with laws and standards and procedures. What do you see as some of the common challenges that companies have today that may be a little different than they had previously?
Yeah, well, I think there's multiple challenges, Susan. But I think some of those challenges are kind of not new. It's just that to date, collectively, for the most part, as a kind of industry of peers, we haven't necessarily figured out how to address the challenges, even as old as some of them might be. And I'll give a couple of examples. You mentioned about compliance and so on, and what always comes to mind for me is still how siloed organizations are. And how that actually, what that does from a financial perspective is it completely hits the bottom line. So, for example, whenever I've run a security function or a compliance function that is not revenue generating, I remind myself and my entire organization that every cent that we spend, or every penny that we spend, or every centimos that we spend is coming straight off the profitability of the company. So when we think about it through that lens, if you like, through that perspective, then it's not just about being compliant with regulations, for example, because we might face a fine, because again, that's that loss avoidance kind of mindset, which is still true. But it's also that everything we spend, whether it's time, money, resources, on fixing a non-compliance, that is margin dilution for the company. That is straight off the bottom line. And then at the personal level, that affects my bonus opportunity and your bonus opportunity. So then we think, so we've actually got a financial performance problem because of this kind of siloed complexity. So I'll give an example, because I don't want this just to be a problem statement kind of thing, an example of how we can literally address that in a practical way. So if, for example, if you're part of the CISO's organization, most likely you're probably involved in some kind of program to say, hey, we need to demonstrate and report to the board on the maturity of our cybersecurity posture and our cybersecurity program. And so what a lot of companies do is they'll bring in a third party to say, hey, can you assess our maturity, which is still mostly questionnaire-based and opinion-based and sample-based, like an audit almost. But they'll come in and they'll say, well, measure us against, for example, NIST CSF framework. And so based on the NIST CSF framework, give us a rating on what's our maturity for cybersecurity management. Elsewhere in the company, you might be under obligations for Sarbanes-Oxley. And so there's no doubt another entire program that's being built up by a different group of people to say, hey, we've got to meet our SOCII compliance requirements. We have all of our attestations we've got to do. And within Sarbanes-Oxley, there's this little section called Section 404. And we look at Section 404, that's pretty much IT centric about, access control and integrity of data and so on. Now, when we look at it through that perspective, then a lot of those control objectives are almost like for like some of the subcategories of NIST CSF. Yeah. And yet what we're seeing there now is we've got two different programs being spun up by two different groups. Maybe if we're lucky, they're speaking to each other, but if not, they're going after the same evidence sets, if you like. And what does that mean? We've got duplicative activities. That's margin erosion right there, that we are not being efficient. And part of the challenge with that is because to date, it's been mostly a human with some, business intelligence support, as opposed to, some of the things that we can do more creatively. So I think, Susan, that is just one example of some of the challenges. And to compensate for that, by the way, I know I've said this a few times, and some people kind of laugh and then get startled and then kind of laugh again, is that, from a methodology perspective, we look at threat actors as not only being like cyber threat actors, like an advanced persistent threat or somebody who's going to, launch a ransomware attack against us, but a threat actor could also be a regulator or an auditor. Now, non-malicious, but nonetheless, if we fail to meet our obligations under a particular regulation, that represents a material threat to our business operations, just in the same way as an APT would. Our internal users, our contractors are essentially threat actors. They might not be malicious threat actors, though those disgruntled ones may well be, but again, they're still threat actors because the definition of a threat actor is any entity or anything that represents or can represent a material impact to our business operations. So when we think about it through that way, then a lot of these solutions, if you like, is if we're addressing closing the opportunity for a cyber threat actor, we are simultaneously closing the opportunity for us to fail to meet one of our regulatory or citation obligations or contractual obligations. So I think those are some of the challenges that keep coming up every single time, Susan, as we over the years, not just since we formed Mercury. And I think that kind of approach of looking for some of those systemic commonalities is really what really drives a kind of an efficient way forward.
I think, Gavin, if I take a couple of things away from your comment, we've always thought about threat actors as this external force or something that's going to have an impact on our data protection. But your point is anything that impacts the bottom line, that takes cost or results in cost, that takes away from revenue, is really a threat. And we should think about not just those external threats, but all of the internal threats, not just regulators or auditors, but even the threat of duplicate controls, right? That is really affecting the bottom line. I do want to talk about threat actors as long as we have that conversation, and because it is front of mind, I think, for a lot of people, which is the recent CrowdStrike incident. And you've talked about threat actors as being internal as well as external. But I think in this particular case, there's a lot of discussion around CrowdStrike. And now I've even seen in the news yesterday that Delta has said they've lost $500 million of revenue, to your point, because of the cost of this particular situation. A couple of questions for you. Number one, how do you think about that, and how have you been analyzing the news on this, and what's Delta's responsibility? Do they have any responsibility here as well?
All right, so without doing any legal representation for any party involved,
okay,
I'll put that as the caveat. But I think there's a couple of things. The first thing it made me think of, actually, Susan, years ago, it was the group CIO that I was meeting with of at that time, I think it was the largest gas and oil company on earth, or certainly in the top 2 or 3. And he made a really interesting comment in the context of, cybersecurity and operational risk. And he said this, he said, don't create a monster to slay a dragon. And the point he was making is the dragon is a mythical creature. And so sometimes in cybersecurity, we can start to be so focused on this mythical creature, the thing that we fantasize might happen that might never ever happen. And in doing so, we create a monster. And so when you think about it, there's actually an irony to what happened with the CrowdStrike event, is that, if you're looking at it through the eyes of a CISO, and we're looking at all these cybersecurity controls, do we have this in place? Yes, we do. Is it effective? Yes. Is it reported home? Yes. Awesome. One of those things that we would be looking at is, hey, we're using CrowdStrike. Is CrowdStrike performing the way it's supposed to? Is it deployed on every single device that we see? And it's like, yes. So through the eyes of the CISO, awesome. So when we think about what happened with this whole event, fundamentally, it wasn't that there was a cyber attack. It's that there was a piece of our infrastructure, and by ours, I don't mean Mercury, I mean, for anyone that was using CrowdStrike and was impacted by it, there's a piece of the infrastructure that's intent was to protect the company. But because of procedural failures, it had the absolute opposite effect. It became the monster. So it's there to actually slay a dragon, but it became the monster, but because it was the procedures of this kind of mass deployment. The people can argue and question whether things were tested right, whether they should have been tested right, but fundamentally, even if they were not tested correctly, or even if the test scripts were automated, and they were kind of fantastic 3 months ago, and now they were terrible, so let's assume that was the case. There was some kind of testing process, but somewhere along the line, there was this one situation of like, hey, what would happen if we upgrade everything overnight?
Yeah.
And it breaks. And that's exactly what happened. So that wasn't a cyber attack. That was a monster that was created from trying to slay the dragon.
And if you're Delta or any other company who was affected by that, what's their takeaway here? What questions should they have asked that obviously had not been asked, either internally or to their third party?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts on that, Susan. So first of all, is like, again, I mentioned our background in the outsourcing business for a reason, and that is, when a company outsourced services to us when we were at HP or HP DXC, they would still apply the same rigor to us as they would to their CIO or their product development teams, their internal teams, because they expected the same kind of result from us. So I think what part of the challenge is, and maybe a question that, as an audience, we can all ask ourselves, is what kind of rigor are we applying to these technology and or service providers that are providing services to us, number one. What assumptions are we making that might not be true? And how do we then take those assumptions and actually validate them as true? So in this case, the assumption that, hey, the SSDLC processes are all fine and dandy and they're all working well. Well, is that an assumption, or do we have that verified? Because if it was an internal group, we would certainly put rigor around that and have it verified. I think the other thing is, I saw the news about the lawsuit, and again, not speaking from a legal perspective, but it's like, if you have a massive financial impact, the first thing you're going to do is say, where can we recoup some of that cost from? Right? Because again, that's straight off the bottom line. That's hit revenue, and therefore it's hit the profitability of the company as well. So in that desire to say, well, let's go sue CrowdStrike. Here's how I look at that. That would be like if I get a speeding ticket, me trying to sue Dodge and saying, well, you sold me this Challenger Scat Pack, so it's your fault that I got this speeding ticket. It'd be the most ludicrous accusation to make. So I have to take accountability for how I use that car. And so, again, without knowing all the details intimately, I just know when we were in that kind of business, we used to service certain airlines as well. We would not do a mass upgrade of every self-checking kiosk overnight. So that's what I mean by a process failure. We would do small batch, larger batch, larger batch, larger batch, so that you never run the risk of taking out every part of that function in one fell swoop. And that's the kind of thing that I think we just saw happen with the CrowdStrike situation.
And I think, Grace, I want to switch over to you for just a moment, because you're a platform provider. You're providing services to any large number of clients. And I would imagine, this has given you an opportunity to kind of reassess your existing processes How has your thinking evolved over the years, particularly with regard to policies, procedures, controls, third party?
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about how we are constantly growing, and we're having to have all these new regulations that we need to assess. And so historically, when I started my career, historically that was done manually. And I would have a team of GRC folks, and what would happen, you was talking earlier about my background in learning human motivation. As a GRC director and a leader in GRC, a lot of what I need to do is look at where my team interacts with the stakeholders across the organization, especially like our delivery and our operational folks, and not be seen as another roadblock or a barrier. So there's a couple of things that happen with that. When we look at how we interact with those teams, we need to say, well, why is what we're asking them to do important? Why is it important to them? Not just why is it important to us? And so there's a couple of things we look at. One is, the use of AI, the use of auto. It started with me with the use of automation, and that was the ASET, the automated control efficacy. I'm always looking for ways to create efficiency and scale, because if I don't, then either the team and myself and my team are seen as a barrier. I always like to equate it to that old commercial in Staples, or I think it was like a no button, and that's what compliance is usually. No, you can't do it. No. And so what teams do is they avoid us, and then we're brought in last minute. So when it comes to things like regulatory compliance, where that becomes problematic is if you don't bring us to the table or evaluate these things when you're doing deals, you're going to probably forget. You're going to miss out compliance requirements. We don't go away. The requirements don't go away. And so to Gavin, you were talking earlier around, it will have margin erosion, because eventually you're going to have costed your contract with your customers in a certain way. And then you may not have accounted for all of the controls you needed to have in place. And we're going to come in and either proactively, or if we have our third-party auditors coming in, at some point, this is going to be audited, and we find that gap, and we're not going to say to you, oh, sorry, okay, well, you didn't cost for it, so therefore you don't have to do it. You will have to do it. And if you haven't costed it and shared that responsibility appropriately, or at least costed it into your model appropriately, it's going to hit your bottom dollar, and you're going to have margin erosion. The other thing, though, that happens is, additionally, if we're always the naysayer, or always problematic, or there's always a delay and there's a lot of work to do, people avoid us. And the other thing that happens, not just margin erosion, is just operationally, is what I've seen over years is the contracts folks will be negotiating a contract, and then very last minute, they come up to compliance and say, hey, we've got this new regulation. I just want to confirm, the customer wants to confirm we're compliant with this random regulation that we've never heard of. We haven't tested against it. And it's Thursday, and we're supposed to be signing Friday. Can you get us back to and confirm that we're compliant? Well, we can. It means that I have to pull my team off of everything we're doing, or at least one or two people. Look at this regulation, get with our legal department, evaluate it, or even if it's not even a legal regulation, it's just a framework. Evaluate that against our current controls, determine if we have the controls in place, and then determine if there's gaps. And if there are gaps, what are those gaps, and is there a cost associated with it? So when I discovered you guys,
Let's go to the next slide, because I think I
what
appreciate.
we discovered is we could do this on massive scale at speed. So that, for me, anywhere that I started with automation, and then as the last few years progressed, automation has turned into AI and machine learning and intelligence. And so for me, that's where our when it comes to regulatory compliance, where we've been migrating, is how do we do this faster, more efficient, on scale.
And so you took a regulation, you mentioned your concerns with privacy globally, and you're a NIST shop as well as other standards, I'm sure. But tell us a little bit about the evaluation that you did, or how did AI actually help accelerate this work for you?
Yeah, so one of the things we discovered, like most companies, is you have your corporate policy standard, policy structure, and then you'll bring that down in a tiered system to control standards, control procedures, implementation procedures, policy. I mean, the cookbooks and things that the training manuals that the departments are using, and you get siloed. And so documents, while there is a hierarchy, it's very difficult on a large scale, whether it's Guidewire or any in my the other organizations I've worked for as well, is it's very difficult to keep track of all of those documents. And then when you're trying to do your maturity assessment, or you're trying to do an assessment against a new regulation, or you're trying to pull the documents together, ready for an audit, for an ISO audit or SOC audit or PCI or whatever, you're needing to pull all those documentations together. So one of the things we engaged in is we said, okay, well, we have siloed documentation, and I can bring all of that together. And again, I can throw a couple of people on that, but it means they're not doing something else. Or we can take all of those policies, procedures, standards, whatever the documents are, we can put them into the system like what was 4CRisk.ai, have AI generate that. And what would have taken my team weeks, maybe months, and a lot of pulling everything together, we were able to pull that together, put it into the system. We had already, we were working with you, so we already had our controls in there, and within minutes, we were able to get results on where did we have a map. We had that control mapping, and to see where we were green, we were great. We don't have to do anything on there. We had some amber, maybe we needed to beef up that, or maybe we had gaps. And so for us, it was the speed, the efficiency, and the scale. For the other thing for me is I also love that it's the efficiency part of that. So because we're taking the human factor out, there's a little less debate over the initial review. We don't remove the human. Let me be clear about that. The
Yes.
human is not going away. However, it creates a scale and efficiency. We brought this in for the other thing is I didn't use it just for GRC. We're not using it just for GRC. We brought it in, and we brought it to our legal folks, and we brought it to our compliance folks, and we got it in front of them. And initially, people were a little bit apprehensive, like, oh, well, are you trying to replace us? No, we're not. We're trying to make your job faster and make it easier for you. So that's kind of where we went with this. We
Wow.
were to bring a lot of things together and rationalize them and harmonize them, and do it in speed and with cost efficiency as well.
Well, the point you made about the fact that you had so many different documents, and it's so true, right? All the standards, the controls, the policies, the FAQs, they're in so many different departments. They're written in different formats, and the ability to leverage technology to load them all up, parse them, and then map them up against your standards is, that's what technology should do for you. And so, Super, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The game changer is AI. Finally, a technology that's been around, but it's having its moment in compliance and risk. What is it that AI brings to the party? Certainly, Grace mentioned efficiency. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. In fact, I see a question from the audience on impact of AI when looking at the threats. I'll try to answer that question also. We all have come a long way with artificial intelligence. In fact, AI is constantly shaping our future in many different ways. More so for our world, it's helping organizations assess the design efficacy of their compliance artifacts and so on, right? AI's ability to handle large volumes of data makes it a core enabler for organizations as they look at their unstructured data. Thanks to AI, we can now interpret content that is available in different formats and extract meaningful insights from those documents. This is highly relevant for risk and compliance teams because much of the data remains unstructured in their part of the world. These artifacts are available in PDF, Word, HTML documents, that too in different formats. AI can read complex regulations and legal documents, identify actionable insights, for example, from those documents for business units. It can generate business language obligations. Gavin mentioned that there are NIST standards and there are security standards in SOX 404. And AI can identify such kind of similar and related requirements across jurisdictions, products, and services, and simplify that language for the business and for the users. AI can assess the design efficacy of compliance artifacts, such as these policies, procedures, risks, and controls, to identify gaps against their obligations. It can accelerate the regulatory change management process, right from scanning the horizon to identifying the changes to helping organizations conduct impact assessments and recommend actions that are relevant for that particular change. AI assistants are here. It can improve the overall time to response for first line and business users with relevant context, driving relevant context to their questions by providing comprehensive responses and overall better engagement. I honestly feel that we're just getting started and already switching gears to a much faster and efficient way of working as we make progress.
And you said there was a question in the chat.
Yeah, and that was to do with the impact of AI as it applies to the threats. And these are the various ways we are able to address that impact. We are able to bring AI to address such kind of requirements for our users.
And super, as you were saying that and thinking about the question, it also made me think, again, back to the kind of experiences that I've had in the past. I'm sure you've had very similar ones. I remember going into an organization who will remain nameless, and we go into the room, and it was a group of different people, lawyers and different business unit leaders and so on. And the question was basically, or what they were working through was or talking through was, threat scenarios. And as I was there, I was my first time with them, and I asked the question, said, has this kind of stuff actually happened? I was like shocked. And they're like, no. So it's basically just people around the table spitballing around, what a potential threat could look like and what the potential outcomes could be. And, so to answer that question specifically, what's the impact of AI when we look at these threats? It's able to take a much larger perspective than anybody in that room. And actually put that in the context of our current operations. And therefore, it's not going to give us the 100% answer. Grace, you mentioned it earlier. There's always that human factor. But the human doesn't know that massive landscape, whereas we can use AI to look at that landscape and then bring it to a meaningful, say, hey, here are the threats that are most pertinent to your organization as your operation, something that a bunch of people with no matter how many hours have given us we couldn't address. So I just thought it was interesting perspective on that as well. Super. And I think the demo is really going to help solidify how this can all be pulled together.
Super, over to you. Let's see the technology.
Absolutely. One moment, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, we see it.
Excellent. What you're seeing here is our regulatory research database. It's essentially a data lake of external regulatory requirements from multiple authoritative sources, be it the US federal regulations, state regulations, the legislation itself, the guidances provided by agencies, all are captured as part of our data lake. It can be the information security standards, country-specific requirements. As a subject matter expert, I can start by providing my scope for research, and system nicely summarizes this information for me. It captures how many requirements are there by sections, subsections, and also generates topics that I can use to further narrow down my search results. And based upon my area of interest, I can go to that section or a particular section or a subsection where that regulation is contained. Now, from there, I can interact with other users in the application to understand what's the relevance of this requirement for my business. This can be the legal subject matter experts, the government business division team members who can answer those questions for me. And as I'm looking at this information, if I find particular area relevant for me, I can pick those areas and save it into something called rulebook. Now, this is something that used to take days and months by multiple subject matter experts, an army of people, is now getting done within a matter of seconds, where AI can extract this information and present this information into an understandable format for users. This is just an example of privacy requirements extracted by AI. I can clearly see which requirements are available for me here to review. All these requirements are extracted, nicely organized by section, subsection information. And I can also see AI is trying to help me here by making me understand which requirements are actionable or not actionable. For example, I can group these requirements by something called type to understand which requirements are informative in nature, or definition type of requirements, and which ones are permissive, prescriptive, or prohibitive, thereby making it more actionable for me. I can understand the matters such as, are these requirements related to disclosures, policies, record keeping, or so. AI also generates these topics and subtopics so that I can understand similar requirements or related requirements, and I can create a global rule book of requirements from multiple sources to identify such similarities. AI can also generate business obligations as they review this information. They just click a button and system automatically summarizes these requirements by identifying similar requirements across jurisdictions, products, and services. I can go into a particular requirement and see what AI has generated, see the citations that are referenced in those related to that obligation. And as you can see here on the right-hand side are actual requirements from the authoritative sources verbatim as is, and AI has generated a summary of that information that is applicable for the business users and the first line. Right? Now, as I compile this information, as I gather this information, I can now conduct a compliance assessment against my compliance artifacts to see if there are any design weaknesses. That is done by our compliance map solution. Essentially, what's happening here is compliance map solution is comparing two separate sources of data. On one side, it is looking at regulatory requirements. On the other side, it's looking at organization's policy. This is a visual representation of a compliance map. On the left vertical, we have a rules inventory that is from different jurisdictions, GDPR, CCPA, US federal regulations, all these are captured on the left-hand side. And on the right side, we have organization's policy. It can be any artifact for that matter. It can be it can be a SOC 2 report too. As soon as users upload this information, application parses this information into logical sections and subsections to paint this picture. It is now showing in this green node that there is good coverage available for that regulatory requirement in the organization's policy. Yellow node signifies that there is partial coverage available. Subject matter experts can review this further. More importantly, these red nodes signify that there is gap in the compliance program for the organization. And that is an assessment that was done within a matter of seconds by AI. As a subject matter expert, now I can go to the unmapped sources and I can ask Arya to provide recommendations for me. As Arya provides recommendations for me, I can see what is it asking me to do. It's letting me know that I should implement a training policy for individuals who are handling CCPA. Now, this kind of a compliance map is quite powerful in helping organizations understand not only gaps, but also understand redundancies. Now, compliance map also helps organizations build a traceability of their artifacts, right from connecting their external regulatory requirements to their policies, procedures, risks, and controls. Now, on one side, organizations do this work where they are conducting gap assessments. And while they are doing that, system is scanning the horizon to identify changes as those changes are occurring in from the authoritative sources. As soon as a change occurs, system captures the change and presents it to the user on their dashboard. And it also automates a regulatory change management process for the organization to address that change in a timely manner. Here is an example of a change that came in the form of NIST 853 version 5. As soon as the change came in, system picked up the change, presented it to the user, summarized the information for the user. Along with the summary, there was a PDF document that was presented as part of the change. System captured that change too. Now, asking a few simple questions, system has decided what workflow should be used for addressing this change, and it has extracted the previous version of the document to facilitate the change management process. As the user moves to the next step, AI is parsing all this information to identify relevant requirements that are applicable to the user. And it has extracted all that information into section and subsection information, identified what is actionable, and it is also doing a business impact assessment here, identifying which business is impacted, which location, product, services, and risk categories are impacted, thereby showing you the trend of risks as these regulatory changes are happening. It paints the picture by showing you clearly what changes have occurred here. Something that has changed, it strikes off. Something that has been added, it shows in a new, in a different color, so users can understand the change. And as all this work is happening by AI, it's automatically doing all this work. It is also automatically identifying policies or artifacts or controls that may be relevant for this change assessment. And as users answer basic questions related to the change, now system paints the picture again for them from an impact assessment point of view. It's letting them know that as it compares the information to these policies and procedures, there are a lot of sections that are already covered for the organizations. Likely this happened because there was a previous version of the document that was used to do the compliance assessment. So it has painted that picture, and then now it has identified gaps. And these gaps could be the new changes that came in along with the change that was captured by the system. Users can identify action items, they can ask for recommendations, and all these action items are tracked in the system for closed loop monitoring. 4CRisk has made sure that this impact assessment and the workflow related to action item is least disruptive for the organizations. Typically, organizations have an implementation system where they track these action items. So we drop these action items into their system. As soon as those action items are implemented, we capture those back into our system for the purpose of reporting.
So super, just in a summary here, you're taking the standards for NIST, for example, or the laws that might affect a particular company, and you're parsing it down into small text fragments. And then you're taking a company's internal documentation, their proof of their evidence of compliance, their policies, procedures, standards, parsing that, and then mapping that together to generate that kind of compliance map. Is that
That's absolutely true. The whole 9 yards are covered by AI. 80% of the work is being done by AI as this impact assessment happens. And then there is a human in the loop to review that information, make edits, make changes, and then confirm that they have taken all their actions. That's essentially what's happening.
Thank you so much. Let's continue on with a question for Grace. Grace, as you've been involved with this, you're using this tool, but as you see this ability to compare large sets of documentation, have you thought of other types of use cases that might be relevant?
Well, yes. Every time I look at the tool and use it, we've come up with different ways that we can use it. One of the beauties of the system is that because you all are using a private LLM, it allows us to do a little bit more with that system versus if we were in a public environment, we'd be much more restrictive on what we're using it for. So right now, my team's looking at how do we use this to parse out the documents we're getting in from our third-party vendors. That's another big time-intensive process. We talked earlier about, the most recent breach and incident, and a lot of that is around due diligence that companies have on valuating their third parties. And so doing that, that's another part of the team, group of my team, but it's a lot of work. So if we can use the AI to read through those documents, evaluate what the controls that we're requiring of our vendors, and then map it back. Again, we're not taking the human out. We're still going to evaluate that in the context of our work and what we're buying from that customer, from that vendor rather. But what it does is it takes that first run through to say, if we've got 10 or 50 requirements, controls, can you tell me if they're mentioning that in their maybe their SOC audit that they give us, or their 10K or 10Q? Can we evaluate those things really rapidly?
There's a couple of questions here.
Go ahead, Yul.
You're having a look. Ann Bader asks, on design, how do you evaluate the percentage of potential error as well as monitor your assessments? And are you able to use compliance documents such as various insurance and national or international rule books and standards?
I'm going to start with the second part of that question about international standards and rule books. The answer is yes. There's over 2,300 global jurisdictions that are already loaded into the data lake, and setting up maybe something that might be a county jurisdiction in Sydney, Australia is certainly doable if we get down to the county level. The other part of that question, at the beginning?
Percentage of potential error. So that's a confidence score.
Confidence factor. Talk about that, Supro, because we provide a confidence score as well.
Yeah. So explainability is at the paramount importance for the platform as we were building this. So what we do is any predictions you are seeing, whether it's a yellow line or a green line, anything that you see in the system or the parsing of the document, we present confidence score for the users so they can see if it is at a high confidence score or a medium confidence score or a low confidence score. Also, from an explainability point of view, we make sure that we are showing the artifacts from where this information was obtained or any predictions that was done. So that helps you evaluate the potential errors that can exist.
Thank you. Is there another question?
There's a lot of questions here, and Alan Rogers is asking about it's great in terms of compliance. Is there also some risk management component such as optimization? So this is really going to Gavin. There's a few of them for Gavin. How effective do you believe AI can be used in this way to start to quantify specific types of risks? So maybe you can talk about how Mercury and 4CRisk are working together to make sure that risk quantification is surfacing the right scores for cybersecurity.
Okay, so I'll answer those two questions kind of in tandem. So I think part of the question was, how effective is AI in quantifying cyber risk versus operational risk and so on. And I think one of the key kind of fundamental things that is going to make it successful or not is AI is only as good as the data that it has access to and the biases that it's presented with.
Yep.
So therefore, I use the example, if you have a design for a car, and let's say it's back in the day, not even back in the day, some companies still do, hand manufactured vehicles, like Aston Martin used to be like that. Well, if you've got a design that's fundamentally flawed and you're using humans to build that car, you're going to produce 10 bad cars a year. If you're using a whole automated production line, you're going to produce 100,000 bad cars per year. So one of the kind of key pertinent things when we're using AI is to make sure that we're actually giving it the access to when we say the large language model, is really to data that is pertinent where we can flush out its biases, so it can also understand data that's actually leading to a wrong conclusion versus data that's leading to a good conclusion. So what do I mean about that in practical terms, and how would that work with, let's say, operational risk and the optimization of risk? If we're going to optimize risk, the first bias that we have to take out of the equation for AI is the bias that says reduce risk at all costs. So, for example, one of the companies that I joined as a new leader in that company, on my draft scorecard, it said, your role is, amongst other things, to reduce risk. And I said, no, it's not. Because the role should be to optimize risk. So that bias of saying reduce risk at all costs, and we think about it in the cybersecurity risk domain, for example, it is almost completely common, almost, that we think that our role is to reduce risk or to remediate risk. So that's a bias that we have to eliminate from AI to say, no, it's not to reduce risk, it is to optimize risk. And therefore, then that's where we see the risk domains converging. Because when we think about it from an operational risk perspective, cyber risk is really one of the contributing domains to operational risk, as opposed to necessarily a siloed domain in of itself. So that's how we do the optimization. Data that's trustworthy, that also includes incorrect conclusions, and making sure the AI is modeled in such a way that it's biases of thinking our job is to reduce risk rather than it's to optimize risk. And then the third and most important thing that has to be put in the context of the operation itself. So not all risk is about optimizing financial reward. You know, the denominator might be human life.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the kind of biases that we need to make sure we have baked into the model for the AI to be effective.
Right. We have another question as a follow-on from that, Gavin, and maybe or Susan can answer this, which is, how is the 4CRisk small language model that is trained exclusively on the risk and compliance corpus able to reduce hallucinations? Is that a factor?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the whole nature of small language model is such that it is designed to perform specific tasks such as risk and compliance tasks. Large language model, on the other hand, perform generic tasks. They're trained on so much data, so much bias exists that there is a natural tendency for it to drift, for it to hallucinate. Because small language has smaller parameters, smaller size of parameters, so that's why it has the ability to predict results in a much better fashion here.
Mhm.
Yeah, and especially if I could add, we have a client who is using the tool to provide answers to complex questions that the front line has in order to do their job. And the models are trained and only pulling data from this company's existing artifacts, their policies, their standards, their procedures, their FAQs, their training materials. They have lots and thousands and thousands of documents that have been loaded up. So the hallucination it doesn't really exist unless their documents have contradictory terms, right? Because the models are trained and sitting behind the four walls of each customer's tenant, pulling answers from all of their authoritative sources.
And it's also important to highlight that as we can't just depend upon AI to do all the work, there's also engineering that happens within this whole work, because as AI is predicting, there's also reconciliation. So as we talked about it, when system shows the compliance artifact, it's now taking you to the exact location or a section or subsection where the information is contained. So that's how you're reconciling actually. And that's by making it more explainable. Now you're tying in those pieces with the engineering that gets added on top of AI to help you have that level of accuracy. So it's both in play, actually.
Time to wrap up a little bit. It's been a good conversation. I'd like to just go hand it back to Susan, and she can go to our panel members and ask them for some of their parting thoughts.
Grace, we're going to start with you. Go ahead, Grace. Oh, we lost Grace.
I think we go to someone else.
Private
We're going to go to Gavin. Oh, there we go. Grace, you're back.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think for me, it's looking at how are we using AI efficiently, effectively to allow us to scale. How do we bring that motivation into our teams and across organizations? And I didn't talk a lot about my role with Mercury, but I do want to also say, one of the things we're excited about is how Mercury and 4CRisk can partner together, and how we'll be working with you guys to use some of the things that you have to inform some of our risk as well, and then vice versa. But so I'm super excited about that as well. Yeah, so I think just use it and find a way that it can help you to scale and be more effective and efficient.
Gavin?
Yeah, so I think what I mentioned earlier about the insanity is defined by repeating the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, and talked about this view of focusing on risk in terms of value protection as opposed to loss avoidance. So some of the things that we've become accustomed to, those biases, for example, risk equals likelihood multiplied by impact. Well, I mentioned earlier the denominator is not always financial. So if the impact is I lose my life, if I'm 1% likely to lose my life, the risk isn't 1% of my life. If that risk materializes, I lose my life. So that fundamental kind of framework that we've accepted as a community, risk equals impact multiplied by likelihood, is fundamentally flawed. And so for us to be successful as we go forward, it really is about taking a more transformative approach to saying, we're not trying to do loss avoidance. The likelihood does not dilute to impact. If the impact happens, the impact happens. So there's no dilution based on likelihood. When we take that bias out of an AI model, then we almost immediately start to see an operational business-centric view as to what our priorities should be that are going to affect decisions that we make.
Supra?
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at AI, my suggestion would be when you look at AI, I think we all should look at it as a helping hand. There is a human in the loop process that should be part of any such AI systems. I think that helps you govern the systems better. That helps you govern the outcome better. Once again, AI is here as a helping hand. It doesn't replace the subjectivity that human beings bring to the equation. So that would be, yeah.
And I think, thank you. I think my parting comment is, try it. We offer evaluations for no cost so that you can actually get your hands dirty and see what this is all about. It is transformational. We are all thinking about our systems and how we do our jobs, as well as our day-to-day lives and how impactful AI is going to be. So it's super important for compliance teams themselves to understand what this technology can do. So Yo, thank you so much for organizing us. Thank you, Gavin and Grace and Supra, for your insights. And we will make this recording available on our website for any of you who would like to share it internally.
I have one more thing to add. Don't forget, we're all going to be at ISACA GRC. So any of our members on the webinar that are there, come see us. I posted on LinkedIn our booth numbers. I don't remember off the top of my head, but both companies will be there, and we hope that some folks will come visit us there.
Absolutely. So the week of August, next week, or week after next.
We're flying on Saturday.
Okay, see you. Thank
See
you,
you all.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
See you all at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Right.